Hi everyone, good morning. Basically I'm going to take you through the data this morning. You're going to notice that the look and feel of the slides changed a little bit. It's just to help with you able to view the data. It will make your eyes a bit more relaxed. It will just look a little bit different. So I'm going to open with a summary of the data, and I'll go through a few sections a bit more in depth. But then, as Ian mentioned, there'll be more tailored presentations before the panels. So I know everyone's super keen about the attraction recruitment stuff. You will see that nice busy slide, but it will come later on today. So I'm going to take us through our industry. So, as Ian mentioned, we had an increase in the number of companies reporting this year, so up to 589 organisations that reported their data. We did have a slight dip in the number of employees. This was because we had actually some large mergers of large organisations, so their workforce decreased a little bit, and we also had a large FM who last year reported 66,000 employees, but this year only reported 2,000, so we saw a big dip there. And previously we have used ONS as our figure to compare to, like the general population census data, which was captured in 2021. This year we've tailored that slightly, where we're going to be looking at it for the working age of that population, so it'll be anyone between 16 to 65, and we think that's a bit more applicable when looking at the data. So here we have our figures at the top for this year, then we've got those ONS working age figures, and then we've also got the comparison on last year. So what we can see from this data is that for the percentages of women, we've had a bit of a dip, down 5%. This is largely due to the large FM not reporting their data, which I'll touch on in a minute, but it is key to note as we will be using these figures, the 2023 and 2024 figures, throughout today. For ethnic minority groups, we have had an increase this year, which is really, really positive to see, as percentage of women and percentage of ethnic minority groups has always been a focus for us as groups that we'd really like to see increase. So we're moving more towards the ONS figure for ethnic minority groups, but we've still got quite a way to go to the 20.2% and the 50.8% for women. When it comes to disability, we've also seen the smallest of increases of 0.1%, and we are still very, very much behind the ONS figure of 15.2%. When it comes to the LGBTQIA+ community, we have seen an increase of 0.5%, which is really good. We're moving towards that 3.9%. And then for religion and belief, we've had a very small increase. We're quite significantly below the ONS working age figure. For sexual orientation and religion and belief, those are two categories that there is a large amount of unknown data, and we'll see that later on. So it's good to take those two with quite a big pinch of salt, as obviously unknown data does skew data sets. For the under 25s, we've seen a small dip, but we are significantly below the ONS working age population. It's been quite a hot topic in previous years, really trying to attract younger people to the industry, and we're not really seeing that kind of come to fruition in these numbers. And then for the over 50s, we've just got a slight decrease, but it's pretty steady with that age group year on year. And then this final row, which I know is actually very small, is the figures from last year without that large FM. So as I mentioned, the data set that they reported decreased by 64,000. So it's quite interesting to see how that data skewed the data set. So here I've omitted it on purpose, so you can see. So when you look at for women, for example, the decrease we've had is not as drastic as we thought it was from the 29%. For ethnic minority groups, we actually have seen a larger increase, etc. Disability, they reported a really, really low number of people with a disability. So it's actually without them, it was a larger percentage. So we've actually had maybe a dip this year. Sexual orientation, without them was a lower percentage. Religion and belief as well was lower. And then age differed a little bit when it came to under 25s. So it's just good to bear that in mind about how an impact of an organisation that big can have on data set. So I'm going to go through some extra stuff that we collect data on rather than just the protected characteristics. So this is to do with attraction. So We've really focused on attracting ethnic minority groups and women to the industry, and they really are being attracted. So last year, the percentage of ethnic minority groups that applied were 52%, and now that's gone up to almost 56%. And for women last year, it was 24%, and now it's almost 28%. So that really indicates that we are attractive to women and ethnic minority groups, and they are applying, but it isn't necessarily translating into them entering the industry. So here we've got the hiring ratio. So that is the number of people it takes to apply to get one role. So for ethnic minority groups, for every 88.4 people that applied, one was hired. For white counterparts, that was 26.3. So we can see that is so huge. It's such a different number. We did have a slight decrease on last year. Last year it was worse. It was at 90 to 1, but still it's a very, very, very large number. And then we also are concerned about these groups when they're in the industry, like when are they leaving? As Ian said, it's something we are focusing on this year as well. So when it comes to women, almost 46% of them leave before they're 34, and for ethnic minority groups, 51%. So we are attracting these people to the industry, there's blockers of them entering the industry, and then we're losing them quite early on in their career, which is obviously we're losing a lot of young talent, which is not good at all. So we really need to focus on retaining these members of staff as well. When it comes to pay gap, we saw the gender pay gap rise from 18.8% last year to 19.2% this year, and we also saw the ethnicity pay gap rise from 13.8 to 15.7. We've been collecting this data for a few years, and we'd also like in the future to collect on disability pay gap. Not many people reported that. I think maybe 3 organisations reported that this year, so it's something we want to drive forward as it just gives us a better insight. And we'll touch on pay a lot more later on, but just before the panels. When it comes to policies, there is considerable variation in policy adoption. We'll look at this broken down later on today into tiers. But as we can see, we really need to push for monitoring diversity, equal pay and reasonable adjustments as like a top 3. Reasonable adjustments should be 100%. It's a legal requirement, but year after year we see that it has never reached 100%. So that's something we really need to engage with, because promoting and supporting adopting policies is crucial. It is the first step in kind of recognising what we need to do, and then once they are in place, we need to be engaging them and make sure that policies are actually making a difference. Throughout today, well, at least my part of the presentation, you'll hear me speak about tiers. I've mentioned them slightly just now. So when an organisation reports their data, we ask them to select what tier they are. So that's in relation to the client. So we've got our clients listed at the bottom. We've got the 4 transport clients, Morgan Sindall, and then also RICS is a membership organisation. So they fell under the membership question. But if you selected Tier 1, that meant that you worked directly with National Highways, Transport for London, HS2, Network Rail or Morgan Sindall. If you clicked Tier 2, you were subcontracted through a Tier 1, Tier 3, etc. So this year we can see we've had an increase in the Tier 3s, which is really, really positive. We're really getting down the chain. And we can see that the majority of the employees that we're looking at data from are from the Tier 1s, and then the majority of companies are Tier 2, and then we have Tier 3 just below them. Oh yeah, also, you'll see this orange box throughout the presentation with the tiers there, just in case you want to reference the size as we go forward. So we're now going to look at gender, so I'm going to do some of the topics now. So for women, we saw that decrease that I mentioned a moment ago, down from 29.1%, or without the FM, it was 24.9%. And then this is the tier breakdown. So you can see that we had a big drop in Tier 1. That's majority from the FM, so it went down from 33%. For Tier 2, we had a slight increase, and for Tier 3, we had a massive increase. It's also really key to obviously look at the unknowns for these data sets. So for the unknowns, the largest unknown, which you can't really see, was 8.9% for Tier 1, which is quite shocking actually, because we always kind of think Tier 1 is normally the large organisations, they have the resources to collect this data, so why is their unknown the highest value? there seems to be a barrier there. Tier 2 had a lower percentage of unknowns at 6.8%, and Tier 3 the lowest at 2.4%. You'll see throughout the presentation today that Tier 3s have actually done a lot of work to make their data better, which is really, really positive to see. Like, for example, I think last year their unknown data set was 27%, and now it is 2.4%. So they've really done the work there to make their data set really, really robust and reliable. But overall, we've seen kind of variation throughout the years, but we're really, really behind that ONS value of 50.8%, which we're trying to work towards. And this is kind of what's happened over the last 5 years. So we can see that we started off at 22.3% women, and then we had that peak in 2023, and then we've kind of settled out now to the 24.6%. And we can see that these unknowns start to creep in from 2022. So it's something we really want to nip in the bud now, kind of not let that increase at all. And we've had a really very small percentage of prefer not to says at 0.5%. So we're not too worried about that, but we just need to kind of make sure that people continue to collect this data. And we need to focus on carrying on working towards getting to that 50.8%. Wait a second. Those percentages are the wrong way around, my bad. The 50.8, it should be the women. We also broke down the data via sectors, as we think that's quite interesting, especially because we have that influence of the large FM. So when I show you this data, please bear in mind that the sectors aren't weighted equally. So for example, real estate had under 2,000 employees reported in that sector, whereas rail had 200,000. But it's kind of interesting to see how the different sectors are doing. So here we have the ones that kind of perform better than the industry benchmark and the SME value. So FM and real estate lead the way, indicating strong percentages of women, and followed by other ones in green, such as house building. And then we also have now the blue ones, so they're in between the industry benchmark and in between the SME value. So they're on their way, but underperforming a little bit. And then we have one that is of particular concern, which is the waste sector, where there's only 12.6% that are made up of women. So we really need to prioritise engagement, specifically with the red sectors. We collected data, I think, on something like 80 sectors, so this is just some highlighted ones, but all the ones that we do have in red and in blue are the ones we really need to be engaging with. And we also need to engage with the ones in green. We need to know how they're attracting women. Is it the culture? Is it the recruitment processes? Is it the organisation's structure? See if we can learn from that and replicate it to kind of support the blue and the reds. I'm going to look at age now. So there hasn't been a lot of variation in age really this year. It's been pretty stable. So we've had a small increase in the under 25s and a small decrease in the over 50s. We kind of have a large proportion of our data set kind of in that mid-career spread. So from 25 sort of 50, 54, that's where we have the majority of our employees in that kind of section. And it's still the same sort of message that we really need to try and get more youth into the workforce to sustain the growth of the workforce. And this is kind of just the age profile, so you can see that we have sort of a peak at the 30 to 39 age range for both years, and then we kind of have a another peak later on in life at 50 to 59, and then we've got the drops. But yeah, we just kind of have that big bulge in the middle, and there hasn't really been much change, not much of a shift. So ethnicity. This year, the percentage of ethnic minority groups increased to 15.2%, which is really great, up from last year at 13.6%. So we're moving towards the ONS value of 20.2. And then here are the tier breakdowns. So we can see that Tier 1 and Tier 3 have pretty similar percentages, both above the industry benchmark. And they also have not huge amounts of unknowns. I mean, they're still significant. So Tier 1 have got 19.1% unknown data, in Tier 3, 20.3%. But Tier 2 seems to be like the problem area. They've got a really low ethnic minority group percentage, and they've got a very high unknown values at 37%. which isn't so great. So they've lost ethnic minority groups and their unknowns have slightly increased. So that's something we really need to engage with, that sort of group. How can we support this data collection? Because it could be skewing the data. Like, for example, ethnic minority group representation for Tier 3, they have decreased their unknowns from 49.8% to 23% this year, 20% this year. So that could have influenced and contributed to the ethnic minority group percentage increasing. So that's why we kind of need to promote that data collection. And these are the year-on-year trends. So since 2020, we've just had that steadily increase of ethnic minority groups. It's always been a focus for us, so it might indicate that initiatives that we are doing are working, as this percentage is slowly increasing. The unknown level is sort of like varied, and the prefer not to says remained pretty small, but pretty consistent. So it's kind of showing that if people are asked to disclose their ethnicity, they are pretty willing to do it. So hopefully we can get people disclosing that. Yeah, and then via the sectors. So, so rail leads the way with the percentage. Oh, that's not coming up. With the percentage above the industry benchmark. That's the only one that we've got on the screen, but others, because the others weren't as key of sectors, but they are such as labour, management consultancy, security, and some others. And then we've got quite a lot of blue, so they're like in the mid-range. So they're in between the SME and in between the industry benchmark. And then we have quite a few more reds. So one that's also we really want to highlight again is waste. So Waste actually did some work where they lowered their unknown rate from 33% to 21.9%. So they're getting a more robust data set, but really a value of 2.7 is really, really, really low. So we need to engage with that. So even though they've increased the reliability of the data set, it's showing that this might be a very true value for the waste sector. And additionally, sectors such as manufacturing and home building have very high unknown rates of 40%. So it casts doubt on the accuracy of their data sets being so low, but we won't know until basically data is reported better. Disability. So representation has steadily increased for disability, but it is very, very low and slow progress. And we can kind of see that there's always been this consistent high unknowns, and we've always had a few prefer not to says. The UK employment rate for people with disabilities has risen to 54%, up from 44% in 2014, and the gap of employment rates between people without disabilities in the general population and people with disabilities is closing. So it's gone down to 29% this year, from 33%, according to Nuffield Health Trust. But we can't see much of a shift in our data set to reflect this over the years. And we can't really tell if that's just because there isn't really being a shift in our industry, or if it's because data is being skewed. And yeah, the prefer not to says has remained pretty stable and pretty low. It's kind of showing that people are willing to disclose this data when they're asked. And we would prefer if people ask this data to their employees and the prefer not to says went up. Like, that isn't a problem. If we see increase in prefer not to says, we then have the opportunity to kind of tackle why that might be. So maybe next year it went up to 20%. Okay, people being asked, why don't people feel that they can disclose this data? That is more impactful than we just need to like basically ask people to keep collecting the data. We want to then put action in from the data. So that's kind of our goal. And that's something that the supply chain school is really working to shift the mindset on, to increase data collection, to allow deep insights, and then look at the impacts of initiatives and schemes to support employees with disabilities. So now we're going to look at the tier breakdown. So here we have it. So one thing to note is you'll notice that the overall value is larger than all the tier breakdowns. That's because the overall value includes the clients. You'll see that later on today there's another thing, I think in sexual orientation, where the value is over all the tier breakdowns. That's because the clients are included in the full data set. So they are having an influence. So we can see the percentage of disability for Tier 1 has decreased this year, the same for Tier 2 but at a smaller rate, and then Tier 3 has increased. And then for the unknowns, Tier 1 we've got 34%, Tier 2 is really high at 49%, and Tier 3 is at 19.2%. So again, it's Tier 2 that has the problem with data collection, and Tier 3 is doing best as well, which is really, really, really good to see. And then the unknowns overall, from last year, the unknowns for Tier 3 were 56%, and they're down to 19.2%, so showing that you can do a lot in a year for data collection. And then this is the disability representation by age group. So we can see that there's no significant age group that has more people with disabilities than others. But what we do say is that the prefer not to says do increase with age. This might be due to people becoming more fearful that they may be discriminated against as they age because they have disability, but we don't really know, but that is something that we did discuss in some steering groups. And then we have sexual orientation. So we offered, last year was the first year that we offered more options for sexual orientation. So we have gay or lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer and other to mirror the census data, and all of those options are being used by organisations. We've had all of those categories reported against, which is really, really good. It shows that people are asking them in their organisations as well. So we saw the highest representation being in Tier 1 at 2.2%, followed by Tier 2 at 1.1%, and then quite small representation at Tier 3 at 0.5%. 41% of employees were identifying as heterosexual, 7.2% prefer not to say, and then the unknowns was 49.1%. So we've seen a gradual progression in the LGBTQIA+ visibility across the tiers, although high non-disclosure rates suggest there's ongoing work needed to foster a more inclusive environment. And then sexual orientation category for all tiers was quite unknown, but specifically for Tier 2 and Tier 3, both of them are over 70% of the data set, so that's 2/3. So really, it's something that we really need to engage with, is sexual orientation. We can kind of see that here as a summary. Year on year, we've had the slow increases. It's kind of always been growing, and we're getting towards the ONS working age figure, but we can really see like this huge amount of unknown data that we really, really need to tackle. It's very similar to the last slide with the big yellow bit where we want to decrease. And then we also had some people that raised that, Ian mentioned it earlier, that organisations feel a bit maybe like uncomfortable asking this data, citing privacy concerns and hesitation, but it is an opportunity where we can educate people around why this is important, why it's important to have an inclusive industry, and ask these questions and support people. So for religion and belief, we had 27% of people reporting that they had a religion. Christianity was the most common faith at 19.6%. No religion accounted for 20%. Unknowns was 4.5%, prefer not to say was 7%, and then any other religions other than Christianity made up 6% of the data set. And then we can see the tier breakdown here. So the largest amount of data for religions was collected in Tier 1, followed by Tier 2 and Tier 3, and then almost all of the unknowns are above the 50% data set. So it's religion and sexual orientation are the least reported data sets. And I wanted to kind of show like how the skewing of the data can impact. So because of unknown, so we have that high 45% unknown rate. And then so it kind of looks like this when you take everyone into account. And then once you remove the unknowns, we start to look a lot more like the ONS working age figures. So here I've removed the unknowns and prefer not to says, to kind of see how what we could get to actually looking at the data like properly. And we found that during the reporting process, there was a common sentiment around organisations feeling uncomfortable requesting those certain characteristics, and it seemed to be ones that you necessarily can't like assume about someone. So the kind of ones that were raised were sexual orientation, religion and belief, and disability were the main ones. People seem to be like, oh, we're not sure about collecting that. But we found generally that if we did ask this data, people did disclose it. So that's really, really what we're willing and wanting to do. And then this next section data is about the core reporters. Ian mentioned these in his intro. So these are the 57 reporters who've consistently reported data year on year over the last 4 years. They therefore provide us a different picture to the wider industry data set, as they can show us the impact of collecting, reporting and benchmarking themselves has had. So this subsection this year is just under 280,000 from those core 57. You can see in the top right, in the orange, the size each year. So over the last 4 years, we've had an increase of about 90,000 employees. And this is their data set against the industry benchmark. So what we can see is that the core group is falling slightly short of the industry benchmark for percentage of women under 25s and LGBTQIA+ employees, but above for ethnic minority groups, disability, religion and belief. Although there's still quite a long way to go when it comes to reaching those targets of the ONS working age figure. The core 57 reporters demonstrated a high percentage of policies, higher than the industry across all of the ones that we collect. But this doesn't necessarily mean that policies have and kind of translate into impactful outcome. Because the next slide I'm going to show you the contrast of this. The next slide will present the gap between policy implementation and comparing reported-based benchmarks against the actual effectiveness of making data-driven decisions. It will highlight the critical need for moving beyond policy adoption to measurable action and accountability. And that is because we've actually seen quite minimal shifts over the past 4 years. But for example, over the past 4 years, this core 57 suppliers has only seen a 0.7 increase in the percentage of women, which should really be a lot more, especially when over 90,000 people joined these companies. Like, the dial has not shifted enough for all the work and all the focus that we've kind of been putting in. It might be due to those retention issues, the barriers to employment, etc. So we haven't seen as much of a kind of push that we would be expecting. For ethnic minority groups, it has risen by 15 to 15.4, surpassing the industry benchmark, which is really, really positive. But it's still falling short of the ONS, but this is the area that has had the most notable progress over the last 4 years for this group, so it should be highlighted. For disability and LGBTQIA+, we've also seen slight increases, whereas for religion and belief, there's been a slight dip, but it's still above the industry benchmark. So this group is really engaging. And youth representation has shown minor growth, but it's still below the ONS working age mark and also the industry benchmark. So while progress is evident, there are still some significant gaps remain, particularly in data transparency. So alarmingly, the percentage of unknowns has kind of increased for all categories in this group, bar sexual orientation, which is not something that we were expecting. We're expecting that if you report every year and if you're engaging with the sex size, if you're engaging with the data, that really your reporting shouldn't get worse in terms of unknown and in gaps. So that's something that we found from this data set. And then also, we kind of saw that the addition of these 90,000 individuals kind of shows there might be some inadequacies in our current efforts to kind of shift the dials, and policies alone have not translated into this measurable improvement and representation of data accuracy either. So we need to drive meaningful change. In order to do so, maybe we should consider dedicated task forces and focus groups, as our current approach, at least within this group, isn't showing to be as effective as we thought it could be. We can't just reduce this to a tick box exercise. We really need to be engaging fully. And despite widespread recognition of the need for diversity improvement at like board and director levels, this acknowledgement has yet really to translate into meaningful action. Too often, organisations voice the need for change while perpetuating the status quo, such as appointing another white male to an already homogenous board. And we're really going to touch on this later about like how can we really shift this and kind of drive change beyond just saying it's bad and then we're not really seeing any changes. I think that we really need to like hold ourselves accountable and acknowledge the problem. Acknowledging it's not really enough. We need sustained action and we need to achieve true progress. We'll discuss the inclusive leadership in the next presentation and we'll focus on how it can become a catalyst for change. I really see the value in using this data to track progress, not just to report data. Otherwise, I don't think we're really properly engaging with the actual efforts to make change. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to discussions in the panels later on.